welcome to everyone to our new set of seminar series for now the Institute. And we have been doing them for the centre, and it's really lovely to see Sydney people as well as we move into an institute. And also in future ones, we'll be doing this as a webinar, as people may be aware of, and we will record them with your permission if you're a speaker. And we will also present them in a way where we don't have the Q&As, and we have these as available to the public, again, with speakers' permissions. So it's a way to present our work to each other. We also invite external audiences to our talks, and it's a way to get your work out there as well. And so we thought it was most appropriate to have Nigel as our first speaker, given he was our director from our previous centre. And also Nigel represents what is really important to the Institute, not just the academic rigour around our research and teaching, but also that important external real-world understanding of the problem. So this is what Nigel brings. He's been in this area of cyber for a very long time. He's been an influential analysis person and in working in various jobs. And one of the most important jobs, I think you might say, Nigel's working for the Australian Federal Police and working at the rank of Detective Superintendent, and also heading up the High Tech Crime Centre for 4 years. So he's done some amazing, important, impactful work. And that's the sort of what we also need to learn about and reflect upon in terms of our research, to think about, are we asking the real questions? What are the things that our work needs to do? What kind of impact it needs to have? So I'm going to pass it over to you, Nigel, and I look forward to listening to your talk.
Thanks, Monica. Wow, what an introduction. You put the pressure on me, but look, it's great. And thank you, Monica, and thanks everyone for your time today. As per the introduction, my interest really does come down to trust and safety in online, in all its many facets and everything. So that's sort of the beat of my drum. Today I'm going to talk about some of my observations about where we've come from, where we're going. And I've decided I'm going to put a spear on it of how organisations, and particularly company directors, so I'm going to be quite strategic with my thinking and what I'm going to talk about. So I want to start off with probably a couple of case studies. And I was thinking last night, actually, what case studies I should use. And I thought there's so many out there and we could spend hours talking about some of the cool case studies. But there's two in particular that I find are particularly interesting. So the first one is, and you might have heard these, so I'll just give a bit of an overview of them anyway. The first one is the Landmark White case. So a little bit of background. Back in early 2019, the company then known as Landmark White, and Landmark White were a property valuation company. They've since been renamed for very good reason. So they had a cyber attack, and they were a listed company. So once they announced to the market this attack, their share price dropped in half from about 50 cents to about 25 cents. They then took their shares, they stopped trading, took them off the market for a couple of months. When they came back on, they dropped again. Basically what happened, the big four banks who would use Landmark White every time they write a mortgage to go and value the property, basically bailed out. That's why they lost all their market share. So the reason I think this is an interesting case study is, firstly, it's a listed company, and it's one of really our first ones in Australia where we can show a correlation between a data breach and a big drop in share price. So that's a real seminal thing. We've got examples from overseas where there's been, particularly in the US, where there's been companies that have been hacked, had a data breach, whatever, and their share price has gone down. Invariably, a lot of those share prices have come back up over time. So this is our big case study in Australia. The other reason I wanted to mention it is it's going through the courts as we speak. And I haven't had a proper read of the news this morning to see it's been reported, but the New South Wales Police arrested and charged one of the IT managers for Landmark White. So an insider attack. So that's the second reason that's interesting. It's an insider. Now, it has been going through the courts in the last couple of weeks. The jury deliberated last week and found the guy not guilty of 18 of the 20 charges. So I find that super interesting. They're still deliberating on the final two charges. I'm afraid I don't know what those two charges are, whether they're the main ones or whether they're just cursory ones. But as reported in the mainstream media, he was basically saying, well, I've been telling this company for years that there's vulnerabilities all over the place. Someone must have used one of those vulnerabilities in a network and exposed a whole lot of personal information. I think you'll find, and this is the ex-policeman coming out, and he's pretty guilty of the whole thing. But as we know in our judicial system, it's up to the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And it's up to the defence. They just got to put doubt in. So that's the first case study, which I think is really interesting. The second case study is another old one, and I picked this one, and it's the Whitehaven coal matter, because as you'll hear Monica and myself and hopefully everyone else talk about, we like to be multidisciplinary. And the Whitehaven coal is a cyber attack that wasn't a cyber attack. So that's the other one I've chosen. So if we wind the clock back to 2013, we had a guy called Jonathan Moylan who was protesting the expansion of the Maules Creek mine. So he thought to himself, rather than do what everyone else does and chain himself to a tractor and all that other good gear, he thought, well, I'm going to do something a bit creative. So ANZ were going to be the financiers for Whitehaven Coal's expansion of Maules Creek. So he got a bit of paper, he got some ANZ logos online, he wrote up a press release and said, due to environmental concerns, that ANZ is not going to fund the expansion. He got off the ANZ website the contacts names for the PR people for their comms, put his mobile phone number down. He also set up a Gmail account called anzcorporate@gmail.com. Anyway, long story short, he puts it out to the media. As we all know, we get the media we deserve in this country. They all jumped on it. All the mainstream news, ABC, Fairfax, News Limited, they all jumped on it. So what happened? A couple of things happened. Jonathan was taking a whole bunch of calls from journos pretending to be the ANZ folk. So he's having a great old day. Secondly, the share price dropped dramatically, big spike downwards. Thirdly, the police come along and arrest and charge him. So his day turned pretty bad eventually. So he went to court. He did the smart thing when you go to court. He took a QC with him. I'm always a believer of going as high as you can when you go to court. He actually got let off, no conviction recorded. We could debate whether that was a good or a bad thing. I would have been impressed if he'd really bought some shares when they were down and done a bit of a pump and dump scheme, but he didn't. And probably if he did, he'd still be in jail today. So, you know, it's often talked about as a cyber attack. You could call it a phishing attack, but really it's just a good use of technology and, you know, an interesting way of gaming the system and gaming people. So that's why that one interests me. So that's how I want to set the scene. We've got a couple of case studies. We've had changes in share prices. We've had people in court, not a successful to a lot of people in court, but we put that to one side. It's not the police's job to worry about that. They've just got to present the best evidence they can. So that's how I want to set today's scene in our multidisciplinary look at life. So if we spin that around, there's a lot of lessons to be learnt for organisations, and particularly, as I mentioned earlier, I want to talk about the strategy side of it. So what are we trying to do? What should organisations focus on? Well, I'm a believer they need to focus on the simple things. And when I say simple, it's essentially as simple as they're really trying to protect, in the first instance, they're trying to protect data. Now, being the old stager I am, and when I started off, it was called high-tech crime. There was no word cyber, it wasn't used. And all the pros in industry, everyone just called it information security. It was InfoSec. And I really think we've lost our way when it comes to what this industry is all about, because it's all about protecting data. If you're an organisation and you live and breathe with an online presence, you're going to have a lot of valuable data, whether that's customer PII, whether that's intellectual property that you own, creating, storing, whether you're an e-commerce provider, whatever it might be, you have got a lot of data. So that's the first and foremost. When I talk simple, I talk data. It's information security. Now that data resides somewhere, resides on systems. So that should be then our next lot of focus if we're an organisation. So what are the systems that this magical information that we create and we store and we alter and hopefully at some stage delete, what are the systems it sits on? Well, yeah, could be cloud, and I'll talk a little bit louder about the systems of national importance and the new critical infrastructure reforms, which include cloud providers as a critical infrastructure piece in themselves. So we have, cloud, we have desktops, we have servers, we have phones, we have all sorts of devices, which is, I call, a system. And that's what this data sits on. That's how this data is consumed, whether it's by an individual or corporate, through an application, whatever. So that should be, I believe, the second focus for organisations. Then we get to the third point, which is the glue in all of this, and this is the people. We need people, and they're the ones that are that correlation between the system and the data. They're essentially the users. So we need to do a lot more to look after our people. And as Monica has often heard me say, in fact, some of you else might have heard me bang on about this, I sort of get a bit tired about every conference I go to and there's some vendor that says people are our weakest link. And until we make some demonstrable changes in how we talk about this stuff, and another one of my favourite saying is words matter, but until we get round to putting the positive spin on that, we're not going to get anywhere. And so there's a lot of consultancies and products out there which do training for people in the online environment. And my general belief is none of them work. If we look, for example, at the statistics from the Australian Office of the Information Commissioner, we've had notifiable data breaches for 3 years and 2 months now. The public statistics tell us that there has been no change over that 3 years of reported data breaches. Not only has there been no changes, but also the pie, how it is sliced, the proportion of insider attack to external attack, the proportion of system outage to external, to internal, to malicious, has been exactly the same for 3 years. So something is not working. Basically, we've got 3 years of nothingness. And of course, unfortunately, the Privacy Commissioner has not done any enforceable undertakings, corporate or personal fines, as is available under the legislation. That's probably a whole session in itself for me banging on about that. So education isn't working. There's no technology silver bullet. So essentially, what are we going to do? How are we going to solve this problem? So in theme with what I want to talk about and keeping it high level is really organisations need to focus on three things. First thing really is going to be governance. And when I think about governance, and when I think about how I talk to an organisation, there's lots of, if you Google the top 5 questions a company director should ask a chief information security officer, you'll get reams of pages of stuff of the so-called 5 questions. But it's been my experience that the responses they get, and I have no issue with those 5 questions invariably, whichever vendor creates them. But it's one thing asking the questions. It's a second thing knowing what response to get. What is the answer that you really want to achieve? And techie people talk techie stuff. Company directors invariably don't. So unless you talk in their language, and their language is about governance, they are governance boards. And I've been fortunate enough to give a number of presentations, particularly into the ASX 200, and it's really revelating sort of some of the responses. So if I was thinking about governance and I was providing advice to an organisation, I'd be saying, you're a governance board, you're governance professionals. How do you not go weak at the knees when you put the word cyber in something and just go about your day-to-day lives? So it's things like, how do they define information security governance? Everyone's going to have their own definition on. In fact, I don't think there's a right or a wrong one. Again, there's international organisations, ASACA and the like, that will give you definitions, but you can change things as you will. So I think organisations need to work out, how do they define governance and information security? Remembering, I'm trying to use the word cyber as least as possible. Once they make that definition, I think we now need to get organisations, and maybe we can help them with this with some cool research down the track, is what are their misconceptions about information security governance? What is it that they understand? What is it that they don't understand? Where are the gaps? Have they done a gap analysis of what their governance framework is? And it's when you start getting them thinking about this rather than racing to buy a firewall or give approval to a budget for something else. Get them thinking at that really high and strategic level. And then they might start working out, for example, why it's important to them as an organization. Again, governance is important for every organization. Information security governance is just a piece of that pie. And at the end of it, we need someone to carry the can. We need someone to be responsible. And one of my strong beliefs is your chief information security officer should report directly to a chief risk officer, not to a CIO function. And I can tell you, I've done presentations with the CIO sitting in the room where I've said that, and I got some amazing blowback, which is awesome because I don't mind a bit of controversy. So that's the governance piece of the pie. So naturally, what should come after we think about governance and what it is and how it is, and how we want it to be in an organization, the next logical step, I believe, is to start thinking about risk. And at the end of the day, it is all about risk. And after it's all about risk, it's all about budgets. Again, cyber is no different to any other risk that directors and organizations have to consider. And it's particularly important now with a lot of legislative and other changes. So sure, company directors are aware of occupational health and safety risk, and they have personal responsibility under many various state territory acts around that. But then trying to get them to understand, for those, say, in the financial services, with the APRA CPS 234 regulations, that they have responsibility. And then you start getting some light globe moments about they really need to give a damn about what is risk when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, our data, the systems it sits on, and the people that use it. Because once they start understanding that there's a bit of skin in the game for them, the light globe invariably comes on. We also have the 2020 cybersecurity strategy, which at about, and I'm going to guess paragraph 37, someone can look it up and tell me otherwise, where it starts talking about responsibility for company directors. So I think we've got some seminal changes coming ahead of us. What the government does with that will be really interesting. What the government does with that with respect to other issues that they're trying to do in company director land, for example, some of the initiatives by giving directors their own director number, and that's really to stop phoenixing activity. But there would maybe a correlation between that and the cybersecurity strategy. So I think it's really interesting they put that marker out there. It will also be interesting with the critical infrastructure reforms, how they deal with company director obligations and responsibilities. So it's essentially is going through a competent risk management framework. And there's two big ones. There's obviously ISO 27001, and then there's the NIST framework. My preference is ISO 27001, but that's what I was brought up to use. They're both great. You can use controls from one to the other. You can use controls from anywhere. You can use PCI DSS controls if you like. But until we get organizations thinking simple things, and again, the Essential 8 is another good one that comes into this, get them simply thinking, what is it that we're going to do? How are we going to do it? Really just taking some big, deep breaths. And what I find interesting is when you're talking to organizations is everywhere is beefing up their cyber security capability, both technically and human-wise, or bringing in consultants. And you hear it a lot about how the growth is going in the industry, and that's awesome. But what I'm not seeing is really that growth in organizations when it comes to IT provisioning. Because it's great to have an IT security team, but if you don't have that provisioning arm, who's going to do your patches? It's not the cyber security people. They don't do that. It's your provisioning team that push out patches. It's the provisioning team that do the backups. And they're just two very simple things coming out of the top 4/Essential 8, which organizations can do. Reducing administrative privileges. Another very simple thing. It's actually, in my book, not done by a cybersecurity team. The cybersecurity team are the ones that might manage a SOC, or they'll do the risk management. They're actually not pushing out updates, patches, backups, looking at Active Directory and working out who has access to what information and why. So I think we're a bit out of lockstep with the things we're trying to do and actually implementing those things. So I'm going to keep on this theme of really being simple. It is all about simple. So doing those very simple things will get organizations a very long way. And of course, it's expensive. People are expensive, kit is expensive, vendors are expensive. We all love vendors. They're an unnecessary evil. A necessary evil. I got that wrong. And they're expensive. And invariably, from when I talk to my colleagues in the industry, the best way they see for purse strings to open up is really when there is a data breach. Logically, for my genuine professional friends out there, they'd like to see things open up before there's a data breach and actually go through and do some competent work when it comes down to risk management. But some simple questions like, when you walk into the office tomorrow morning and the internet doesn't work, is that a big deal or not? And what are you going to do? Some refreshing things like that really get senior management a little bit thinking, because everyone just assumes it's going to work. We're used to waking up in the morning and looking at our mobile smart device and it works. So we assume all our tech for the whole day is going to work. So after I think about governance and after I think about risk, and I probably should say that this is about a full day presentation that I'm squeezing into about 40 minutes or potentially less, because I think we can hopefully have questions, is compliance. And I find compliance to be the next really interesting thing. And I find compliance, you always have to lose to win. So what do I mean by that? So compliance to me is an afterthought. It is something you do later on. You do all your work and you think, I kind of didn't think about compliance for things along the way. We better bolt that on. So logically, organizations would think about it along the way, but it's very hard to comply with regulation or legislation or internal policies if you're taking risk. And naturally, every organization should be taking risk. Doing nothing is doing something. And one of the issues I see with technology and in that risk field is this push to remove or reduce risk, rather than sometimes I believe organizations just should be accepting of it. Now, I'm not on the board of BHP or any of those other highfalutin ones, so it's easy for me as an observer / pundit / commentator to say a lot of these things. But technology is one of the few ways organizations are really going to get productivity gains. We're not seeing industrial relations reform. We're not seeing tax reform. We're not seeing a whole lot of other reform in this economy. So technology is one of those pushing the boundaries. And I think organizations, within reason, need to start accepting risk or put the budget accordingly to it. So compliance is the really interesting one there. So I've already talked about notifiable data breach scheme. We could unpick the scheme to pieces. We could complain that it's, the GDPR is 72 hours and we're 28 days to report. I don't see that as a big deal. I don't see 28 days. So you could say there's a degree of maturity in there to give organisations close to a month to line their ducks up to see whether there was any serious harm, as the legislation tells us. I'm more scathing of the Privacy Commissioner, because they've only commenced 4 investigations and completed none of them in a bit over 3 years. Our critical infrastructure reforms, I think, are going to be the next big piece of compliance. We've had so much legislation in the last 20 years. It just blows me away, and I kind of get annoyed with this lawyer's view of the life of legislating our way out of problems. And it just doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. Our legislation has been used so few times. There is so little jurisprudence out there. I just find it utterly disappointing. If I'm going to get on one of my 100 soapboxes, that is the main one I get on all the time. We're just not doing enough to test our laws. We've got some great laws. Law enforcement have got great tools and techniques. The metadata legislation is a boon to them. They don't need content. Crooks don't talk on phones anymore anyway, or over the wires. There's so many different things. So the next great white hope and the next piece of legislation coming along will be the critical infrastructure reforms, peddling its way through Parliament now. To the credit of government, and I don't say those words very often, they're actually doing a lot of outreach. And for anyone that's dialed into any of their online forums, I've dialed into the last 2. there's actually some really good questions that are coming out from industry, because industry wants certainty in this. And it's great that they're holding the online forums. So we'll see how that winds along. We've got new sectors, as I mentioned, cloud comes into it. Groceries, for example, food and groceries become a sector of critical infrastructure. It'll be interesting how broad they go. Of course, we've got 2 big supermarkets, and we've got sort of 3 next ones, and then we've got everyone else. It'll be interesting if they just pick on those top 5 and say, we just want to get you lined up. And then, of course, compliance, as I've mentioned, with various regimes for company directors and what they do, if they do anything out of the strategy. So we'll see how the critical infrastructure reforms weave their way through Parliament, how they spit out the other end. And, you know, as the old saying goes, there's 2 things you never want to watch in life being made, and one is laws and the other is sausages. So we'll see how that goes. So where are we headed? What's going to really count? I've given a very brief overview very quickly of a whole range of things. So I think there's a couple of things that we really need to start focusing on now. So one is the word resilience. There is a slow movement by a lot of people to stop talking about protecting systems, information, and people to start being a resilient organisation. I think we need to push that and keep pushing that a whole lot more. Protection is a point in time. Resilience is more, it's going to come down to what are you going to do, or how can you do it should you suffer a data breach or an outage or an insider attack or whatever it might be, a state-sponsored attack, something you might get caught up in third-party supply chain. So resilience, and as I've mentioned before, words matter. So resilience is the key. We really need to get our words right with organisations. And I can tell you now, I've given a bazillion presentations where I've scared the pants off people and they do nothing. So spreading the old FUD, the fear, uncertainty and doubt, that doesn't work. Trust me, I've done it many, many times. It's enjoyable to do that, I'll give you that. So resilience is the key and words matter. I just touched on third party and supply chains. Most organisations, in my experience, have got more third parties and more organisations in their broader supply chain, whether that's a physical supply chain or a virtual one, than they realise. So you can have great systems, great policies, great processes and everything, right up until you deal with a third party and give them access to your network. And then things go down a slippery slope. So I think we need to start focusing a lot more on organisations, not just themselves, but also their third party and their supply chain. I think when I look at frameworks, I think of a simple thing, and that is threat intelligence. So, you know, we do a whole lot of great teaching in cyber offense and cyber defense and critical infrastructure and forensics and incident response, and that's all super important. The next step we need to get to is really threat intelligence. So when we look at the schemes, particularly the banking and finance sector schemes globally in Australia, I think that's going to give us our next pointers to where we want to go to with that. So you've got the UK with their CBEST scheme, you've got what's Hong Kong, ICAST, you've got Singapore, and now you've got Australia with the CORI scheme, which came out in March, from principally led by the Reserve Bank, but it is basically getting the sector to fully appreciate and use threat intelligence. So we can give advice to an organisation, and we can give technical advice, we can give non-technical advice, and it's all great. There is a bunch of hundreds of consultants out there doing exactly the same thing. But going back to it's all about risk, and then it's all about budgets, we've got scarce resources. So for organisations to act, rather than say, we're going to do our yearly pen test, is the whole idea of these schemes is to say, no. This needs to be not a yearly thing. This needs to be a constant thing. And you need to understand the threat picture facing your organisation and your industry. And that's what threat intelligence does. And threat intelligence is everything from understanding the environment you work in. If you're a defence or a prime or subprime, you have a lot of issues with nation-state attacks. It's a no-brainer. All that stuff's open source. You can start from there all the way down to working out, are there any of your company's credentials for sale on the dark web? What are the other attacks that are hitting your industry? So one of the things I want to see out of the critical infrastructure reforms, I used the food and grocery sector as an example, is when they get down that track is to enable that sector to come together. And we have the ability to do this under the old Trusted Information Sharing Network, the TISN from, I'm going to say, about 2008, which knocks out competition issues so that CISOs from each of those sectors and organisations can sit down and say, we're seeing this type of attack. You guys should look out for it. And it's one of those, the whole is working better than each of its parts. So that's where we'll get to when it comes to maturity. Threat intelligence is really going to do it. So if you want to do a startup, get into a threat intelligence organisation. Build one yourself. Do something really cool and funky. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it because
Thank you, everyone, for your time. And thank you very much for Nigel's presentation today. Cheers.
Thank you all.